I'm going to take you to one of the most famous royal buildings in the city, which is the magnificent Tower of London. Here it is, a site that many people all around the world will recognise. And perhaps not surprisingly, it's also one of London's most popular tourist attractions. It draws up to 3 million visitors a year. I always find that some of my guests that I take on real life context tours that aren't aware of what the tower is are rather confused. That they hear the name Tower of London and perhaps think it's just going to be a single tower. It is really a castle, and specifically a royal castle. And it all exists thanks to this man. We've mentioned him already. This is William of Normandy, sometimes during his lifetime referred to as William le Bâtard or William the Bastard because he was born out of wedlock. He was the son of the Duke of Normandy, the ruler of northwest France. And it was William the Conqueror who led the famous Norman invasion of England that happens in 1066. Now, we don't have time to go into the whole story of the Norman invasion. There is, in fact, a context online lecture about this, which you can watch on demand if you want to know all the information about this. I'll kind of give you the potted version of the story. Basically, William of Normandy had a claim to the throne of England. And in January 1066, King Edward of England died. And it said that he had promised William of Normandy that he would be the next ruler of the kingdom. But in fact, it was Edward's brother-in-law, Harold, who seized the throne. Now, William of Normandy decided that he was going to claim this kingdom that he believed was rightly his. So on the 28th of September 1066, he sailed over to the south of England with a huge army, and he confronts the army of King Harold on the 14th of October 1066 in the famous and very important Battle of Hastings, which William wins. So thus he becomes William the Conqueror, William I, the new King of England. Now, over the following months and years, William set about strengthening his hold on his new kingdom. And one of the ways he did that was to build castles all across England. This was really to establish his rule and consolidate his power. And it was during this period that he gave the orders for a new castle to be built on what was then the east edge of the city of London. And this was the fortress that we know as the Tower of London. As often happens, the tower was expanded and altered and changed over the following centuries. This artist's impression shows us what it may have looked like around about 1240. You will notice on the top corner there, the huge tower, and this is the oldest part of the Tower of London, and it's also what gives it its modern name. And here is how it looks today, another very iconic building. It's known as the White Tower. It doesn't look very white today, but it did used to be very white ever since 1240, when the king at the time, Henry III, ordered the keeper of the tower to have the great tower whitened both inside and out, was his words. And we presume that means it was whitewashed. So the whole exterior and the interior would have been sparkly and white. And this was, in fact, the original royal palace, because the Tower of London was built as a castle for protection, but it was also intended as a royal residence for the new king and his family. You may notice if you look at the top of the towers, it has these very distinctive curved domes. Sometimes they're called ogee domes or Tudor domes. They are not, in fact, original to the early castle. When it was first built, it would have had pointy roofs. These were added a bit later on. We'll come back to the reason for that in a second. So it looks quite austere from the outside, but when it was first constructed, the interior of the White Tower would have been beautiful royal apartments, heavily decorated, wall hangings and painted ceilings. William also commissioned a beautiful royal chapel for the interior as well, although it wasn't completed before his death. It was his son who finished the royal chapel. Now, in later centuries, the royal family built a new palace at the Tower of London right next door to the White Tower. and it was used by all of the great monarchs of the medieval period. It was a home. It was also a showcase for the wealth and taste of the crown, a place to entertain the great lords and ladies of England, also important foreign visitors. There was even a royal menagerie at the Tower of London, a kind of collection of exotic animals, or a private zoo. They had lions, they had bears, and in 1255, the King of France even gifted the English crown an elephant, which was seen as a great wonder. For centuries, the Tower of London was also home to the Royal Mint, where all the coinage for England was produced. In 1533, this chap that you can see in the photo, Henry VIII, he redecorated the Tower of London in preparation for his marriage to Anne Boleyn. And it was he who added the nice curved domes to the top of the White Tower. The royal couple spent the night before their wedding in the Tower of London. Sadly, of course, 3 years later, the Tower of London would also be the place that poor Anne Boleyn was locked up and where she lost her head on the piece of grass right outside the White Tower that's known as the Green. That was on the 19th of May, 1536. So by the 1600s, the Tower of London was no longer used as a royal residence. It was seen as rather old-fashioned by then. So it became a military base. But it's still, to this day, in fact, it's still looked after for the sovereign by a man called the Constable. The main palace wing that used to stand next to the tower, the White Tower, is now gone. That was demolished. You can see some of the old royal apartments in some of the other towers in the outer walls. As for the White Tower today, well, for much of its later history, it was used as storage by the military. So sadly, we've lost all of the wonderful interiors of the royal apartments. But if you do visit nowadays, it's the home to an amazing exhibition of objects owned by the royal armories. So they have swords, weapons, arms and armor, lots of suits of armor that belong to kings and princes, members of the royal family. You can also see on the left here the royal chapel that I mentioned earlier, a very beautiful piece of medieval architecture. The chapel is dedicated to St. John the Evangelist. So nowadays, the Tower of London is looked after by an organisation called Historic Royal Palaces, and they have described this chapel as the most complete surviving example of early Anglo-Norman royal ecclesiastical architecture in England. It's still consecrated. They do have services there from time to time, and officially it's still a royal chapel, although I don't think the current royal family use it particularly regularly. So the royal family don't live at the White Tower anymore, but other people do. And if you visit, you will probably see some of these chaps, the yeoman warders, who are often referred to today as the beefeaters. They were originally part of the royal bodyguard, and it was King Henry VIII who decided that they should be tasked with protecting the Tower of London. They've also been granted the right to wear these spectacular red uniforms that you can see three of the chaps in this picture sporting. They wear this on particularly important state occasions, like the monarch's birthday. There are currently 32 of the yeoman warders. They're all ex-military, and they do live in the tower. They're very lucky. They're given accommodation inside the tower itself. And you might also spot at the tower today the ravens. So it was supposedly King Charles II who insisted that the ravens that live at the tower should be protected, because there's an old story that if the ravens ever left the Tower of London, that the city of London would fall. At the time, the White Tower was actually being used as an observatory by John Flamsteed, who was the astronomer royal, and apparently he used to get really fed up of the ravens who were constantly flying in front of his telescope. They're still there today. There are 6 of them at the moment. They are called Jubilee, Harris, Poppy, Georgie, Edgard, and Branwyn. And nowadays, they actually clip their wings to make sure that they can't stray too far from the tower. I'm not quite sure about the ethics of that, but they are still there, and London still, to this day, has not fallen.